All right, take three. Starting to be reminded of why I don't do this more seriously. But I have a few caveats to get out of the way immediately. First off, I know I look like shit. I lost the genetic lottery. I don't know what else to tell you, so you're kind of just gonna have to bear with me. Secondly, I am staunchly against any kind of Russian incursions into Ukrainian territory. Um, if anything I'm about to say gives you any kind of impression to the contrary, I don't know what else to say other than you've taken me wrong, because it's definitely not my position. Uh, Thirdly, I am an American, because I'm thinking I'm going to make the title of this video something calling out American liberals specifically. So I am talking about my countrymen here. Um, I'm not an expert of any kind. I don't even have a post secondary education. I went straight from high school into the workforce. So, absolutely take everything I say with a grain of salt. Do your own research. I've been watching a lot of videos today from like Stanford and Brookings Institute. Those are probably some good places to start. Look into some of the people that they've had on the panels in the past, couple weeks, couple months. Um, there are probably some good sources there. So trust someone like that over some random fucking idiot like me. um, what else is there to say? I feel like I might be forgetting something. I think really the only other thing I need to clarify immediately is well, if you couldn't guess by the fucking look at me, um, I'm criticizing American liberals from the perspective of someone further left than them. So if you're looking for like a conservative take on all of this, you're definitely in the wrong place. Um, Up to you if you want to stick around or not, but you know, don't be surprised if we don't see eye to eye. Is all I'm saying. Like, and if you disagree, also don't totally need to be a dick about it either. But, anyways, all of that out of the way, I think that's got it. Um, yeah, I'm doing this because I've been watching videos today, like I mentioned a moment ago, about this whole situation, and before I went on to like the Stanford panels and all that, uh, I was looking at more sort of introductory material, sort of like summaries aimed at the layman who just isn't terribly informed on many things in general. I felt like that was where I was, but as I was watching these videos, like especially there's one in particular that I'm not going to name the video, I'm not going to name the channel, any of that, because I don't want to be involved in some kind of like fucking call out drama or something. Not that anyone would ever notice me anyways, but still. um and the worst part is I generally like the guy otherwise. He's put out some content before that I enjoy, but God, there was this fucking horrendous video where, I mean, it seems like he essentially thinks that the situation between Russia and Ukraine right now is all just a personal thing with Putin, and also that Putin's demands about NATO are none of his business. Like, Russia has no reason to care what goes on with NATO, which is just the most asinine shit I've ever heard. Um, so, for some context, I would hope that a lot of you know what the Cold War is, for fucking starters. But NATO is, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It started with the U.S. and Canada and Western European countries primarily, um, essentially forming an alliance to check the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union was also trying to expand. Um, and you know how the Cold War went from there, I hope. Um, well, of course, the Soviet Union eventually dissolved, and NATO did not. So what's happened since then, of course, is that NATO has continued to exist, and they have been expanding. And there's an argument to be made about um, the role that America plays in deciding what happens with NATO. Um, because you could argue that America kind of gets a bit heavy-handed. They have more of a say than other countries seem to. That's what some would say. Like I said, I'm not an expert. I can't necessarily verify that or not, but it's I get the impression, at least, that not everything NATO has done has been, well, of course, I'm sure they've done shit that they haven't unilaterally agreed on, for one thing. But some of these things really do read like they were kind of just protecting American interests. Um, and of course, one of those interests in the post-Soviet context is to keep in check the Russian Federation, which is, of course, the Russian government entity that grew out of the ashes of the Soviet Union. Um, and when we say Russia today as a country, that's what we're referring to. Which, of course, the Russian. By the way, there are a lot of liberals who don't seem to realize this, and conservatives too. The Russian Federation, as in the country of Russia that currently exists, is not a communist nation. Just to fucking put that out there. God, I hate it when people act like it's still the Soviet Union. It's the most annoying shit. No, they aren't. So, with that out of the way, um, the fact of the matter is they have still, they play to the, I guess you could say, modern superpower role on the global scale. Of course, like China, for example, being another major player that the U.S. is kind of in a low key sort of economic feud, I would guess you could say. Maybe cultural too, though I still feel like American culture is so much more dominant than Chinese culture, at least, through most of the world. Um, if we're talking about like Mongolia or someplace like that, of course, China, they probably get a lot more of that there. But regardless, there's the economic situation with China right now, and of course Russia has been building back up ever since the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and they've been working on their military and to mixed success. Working on their economy. I know that there have been the ruble has taken some spills in the past decade or so, some more dramatic than others. Uh, I haven't been following that too closely, so I can't speak to that. But efforts have been made to keep up as a first world country and a major superpower, um, and so it kind of feels like we're just continuing the Cold War sometimes. Like Russia has made demands of NATO regarding Ukraine because Ukraine wanted to become a member of NATO. That seems to be what kicked off this most recent bout of aggression, is that NATO was in talks with Ukraine to accept them as a member, and Russia didn't want that. And of course, we go back to this whole idea of like, oh, well, why would Russia care what NATO does? Well, Ukraine borders Russia. And the thing is, with NATO making more of an effort to push into Eastern Europe as time has gone on, the more of Eastern Europe they have, the more they're kind of encroaching right up to the Russian border. And the US puts military bases everywhere. We just do. We have bases in places that you wouldn't even think fucking exist. There's a fucking US military base there. We're going to put one on the moon sometime, I'm sure. Um, it just, that's just what we do. And we use our NATO allies as, like, for example, there's a lot of US military traffic going through Germany all the fucking time. It has been for a while. And so I think a lot of the concern on the Russian side is that they're going to find NATO standing outside of their doorstep, just waiting and watching and essentially keeping Russia in check. And of course, you would think, well, isn't that a good thing? Russia doesn't need to be doing shit like what they're threatening to do with Ukraine. And that's right. But is it all that dissimilar from some of the shit that we've been doing? Like, for example, we just fucking watched Afghanistan crumble like a crouton after the US backed government just failed to be a fucking entity after we left. I heard this analogy recently where it's kind of like a tent where the US military presence was like the main central tent pole holding the whole fucking thing up. And as much as you can have like all the other smaller tent poles and tent stakes and the fucking cordage and everything, as soon as you take that center pole out, the whole fucking thing is gone. Um, and that, yeah, that seems like perhaps an apt description of what happened in Afghanistan as the Taliban just within weeks, less even, I don't know the exact timeline there, but they just fucking swooped in and took everything, and the US backed government just ran off with the fucking bag. And that was it. Um and oh boy, the lucky Taliban now get to deal with ISIS K. Um I don't envy those motherfuckers, but you know, congratulations, I guess you got the reins. Time to sit in the hot seat, motherfucker. But yeah, that's kind of something that we've been doing a lot, isn't it? Like we have our own invasions, and of course we always say that there's a benevolent purpose. And we go in and we do some good. Um, we definitely kill a lot of people, like, for example, ISIS or Taliban members, people that, you know, very arguably ought to be killed, or at the very least have their fucking command structure torn down, if there was a peaceful way to do that. But anyways, yeah, we do some things, but then we completely fucking fail to help these people rebuild their country into a functioning entity afterwards. We just leave them high and dry for the most part. Like when the whole ISIS thing kicked off, like Iraq seemed like it was going to do better than Afghanistan, and I mean it did. But there were still so many scenes of like Iraqi checkpoints or garrisons or whatever, where they just fucking fled and they left all their shit behind. And so you started seeing a whole bunch of ISIS members with M16s and other like American hardware that we had given to the Iraqis for them to use to defend themselves. Um, and it just like, I don't know. I don't fucking know, man. Especially Afghanistan is a tricky one when you take the context of Operation Cyclone into account, which was another Cold War situation where Russia had their Afghanistan war, some number of decades before we did. And they had about as much luck as we did. It went a little worse for them, but um, it's just this whole thing of we armed the Mujahideen to fight the Soviet influence there. And then, of course, we saw what became of the Mujahideen when we had to go back and fight them too. Um, great job on our part fucking that one up. But so much of the world has been this standoff between the US and Russia, and of course, with the US having so much control within NATO, it seems to me like NATO has been, at least in some ways, utilized towards that same end, even after the Soviet Union, because it's just everyone wants to be top dog, and for the longest time, it's been the US. And I think something that a lot of people are overlooking is that this seems like a critical moment now where Putin is kind of testing us. It seems almost like we're in a lose lose situation where there are a few options for how this might go. Number one, maybe it is just saber rattling. Maybe Russia will pull back and be like, well, okay, we weren't totally serious. We just wanted to make these demands, blah blah blah. I don't quite see that happening. I would think some kind of concession would have to be given for Russia to stand down because they're taking this quite seriously from the look of it so far. So that's option two there, the concessions. Um, Diplomatic talks with Russia, which so far their demands have been, I wouldn't, I'm not going to use the word unreasonable because I see what they get. I see where they're coming from when it comes to NATO. Like, I'm not going to say I take their side necessarily, but thinking of it from their perspective, like, of course they feel like their interests are threatened. So, and of course they feel like it's unfair. They feel like they're being told that they can't do something that the U.S. has done. Um, so I can kind of get that. And so they've made these demands that are just never going to happen because it's just not the way NATO and Europe and America works. They're never going to stop. Like, essentially, what they wanted was for NATO to undo a bunch of its like newer memberships, pare itself back to how it was basically after the Cold War ended, and no more new members. All this other shit that just, can you imagine? Of course, that's not going to happen, and Russia knows that. Russia knows that those demands would never be taken, um, which is kind of concerning, honestly. That they would say, well, if you want to reach a diplomatic solution with us, you have to do this thing that we know you are never going to do. And so it's like, okay, well, I guess there's no diplomatic solution then, is there? Which, of course, it doesn't just skip straight ahead like that. Um, there will be some attempt made, as I'm sure is being done at the moment, um, to haggle down these demands and see if a more likely agreement could be reached. Um, and I'm hoping that's what'll happen. But even in that case, even then, I think that there's going to be some element of like, essentially, Putin will have tested America and NATO, and the concessions will read to some like a degree of weakness. And so that's going to kind of embarrass the US and NATO if that happens. But of course, if the US and NATO don't reach any kind of diplomatic solution, and if Russia seriously means war, then it's going to be a massive bloodbath for everybody. Like, just a fucking atrocity if Russia is as serious as they seem to be, and if the US doesn't just watch it happen. Because, of course, the US and NATO can't just watch it happen, because that would be the worst outcome for them, is just letting Russia take Ukraine. Oh my god, NATO and America would be permanently and totally fucking discredited in the international community. I mean, Ukraine themselves would feel like NATO just fucking left them to the wolves in that case. Other countries that have already not liked NATO would see it as a show of weakness. They would say, oh, Russia tested them and won. So I guess we can just fuck with NATO now. which historically has been something generally not very advisable to do. Um, so if we show weakness now, we might expect more of the same in the future. So it's this god awful situation where Europe and America don't really want to have to do this. Um, but Russia might force them to. And even just being put in that position already looks bad for NATO and America. Um, God, it's bleak to me, honestly. At least, as someone who lives in America. Um, Something else that bothers me is like a lot of people act like I mentioned to people sometimes, like, I think that America's place in the world is kind of slipping, that China might overtake us or Russia might overtake us as like the dominant superpower in the world. And us Americans, we can't even comprehend that idea that we might be second or third or fourth place for the first time in who fucking knows how long. Is just generally, it does not compute. It's not the life that we're used to leading. And so a lot of people think that if America loses its number one spot in the global scene, that whoever comes out on top will just come over here and put us all in death camps and, nuke the world, and everybody's going to die in radiation and fire and blah, blah, blah. And that's not how it works. When we won the Cold War, we didn't do that to Russia. I mean, I don't know if we wanted to or not, but even if we did, like, we couldn't, not without immense cost to ourselves. That's just not how it works. But I do think that it might be time for us Americans to start thinking about the possibility that whether we like it or not, we might end up in a world where we're in the position that Russia used to be in, a decade or two ago. where we're still a major player in the world, but we're not number one anymore. And I also wonder, once our power starts to diminish, how will the rest of Europe start to feel about us? Like, of course, I highly doubt they're going to be as apt to go along with our like world police thing that we've been doing after we theoretically are um, how do we put it, unseated from our current position, because we just won't have as much say. We won't have as much power to either force people into things or give them agreements that are attractive enough for them to take on the cost of joining us in these Afghanistan-like projects. Um, I'm curious to see what happens with particularly Russia, China, and Iran throughout all of this. Um, but the bottom line is, of course, I don't want there to be a war. Period. Any kind of invasion. Um, People have brought up the idea of like an insurgency within Ukraine, like a partisan movement to resist Russian invasion. And one of the Stanford panels I was watching earlier was talking about how that doesn't seem very likely. I think they're probably right. Who knows? Who knows? Could be wrong, but um, I don't know. If it doesn't happen, then essentially they're just going to have to accept whatever Russia wants with them. If Russia doesn't fade, if there was an insurgency, you know how insurgencies work. They're not a pleasant thing, not by any fucking stretch of the imagination. War in general is just an awful, horrid atrocity, um, just by its very nature, and especially there is, of course, an ethnic element to all of this. I think a lot of Americans don't realize that Russians and Ukrainians do not see themselves as the same ethnicity. Like, to a lot of Americans, like, for example, the relationship that we have with Canada. Of course, we're different countries, but the average American like me does not think of themselves as ethnically different from the average Canadian. We're different countries, yeah, but we're the same, like, people, quote unquote. And we feel that way towards probably a lot of Western Europe too. Like, of course, like the French or the Spanish or the Italians, they have their own culture, of course, but just like in racial terms, like going into like genetic background and everything, a lot of us are part Italian or entirely Italian, at least in terms of ancestry. Of course, culturally and nationality wise, we're American. But like, for example, my family, we can trace my family back to the early 1800s, and as far as we go, it's all just came from Scotland, came from Ireland, just like generations of Americans born and raised here. But if you take it all the way back, it's all Scots Irish stock. And so I don't, ethnically speaking, there's not a lot that separates me from like someone who, the average Scottish person, the average Irish person. Um, that is not the same as Russia and Ukraine. Um, and so that aspect of it worries me too. Whenever ethnic tensions are involved in a war, and especially if there's going to be like a long-term occupation and a resistance movement and all that stuff, like it, that that gets to be um, some unspeakable things happen in situations like that oftentimes. um, Shit like that, just thinking about all the ways that it could go, like the worst case scenarios, is just such a mind-bending well of despair, honestly, to get into for me. um, And I hope that people that are hoping for war because they're sick fucking warmongering psychos may one day come to that realization about just the level of evil that they're pushing for one thing. Um, I don't know, man. It's rough. I'm just kind of rambling at this point. I think I've said my piece pretty much. I just can't stand Actually, no, there's something I left off entirely. Going back to ethnic tensions and such, um, we make this all about like Putin and NATO and all that. So one of the pretenses that Russia used for the seizure of Crimea and the situation in Donbass region is the fact that the NATO friendly government of Ukraine, ever since the 2014 Euromaidan situation, they're a bit sketch. If you've never heard of Azov Battalion or Right Sector, go ahead and look those up. Um, it's it's some dirty shit. Um, Frankly, there's some fucking neo Nazis involved, and the government has taken what were right wing paramilitaries and made them actual units of the Ukrainian military. So there's that to consider. As I said earlier, I'm still not on Russia's side necessarily, but that's still pretty concerning, and I think something ought to be done about it eventually. Um, so there is that factor to consider that just straight up didn't even get mentioned in that video I was watching earlier that pissed me off so bad. It's just they tried to narrow down this complex situation with a lot of historical context right up to the present day. Like, it's not just like, oh, there was ancient empires fought over all this land, and then the Cold War, and then now all of a sudden this is happening. Like, no, there's a continuous line of events that have shaped the world as it is today, and in particular, like the US Russia thing, it didn't stop with the Cold War and then suddenly pick back up again. It's been going on in various extents this entire time, really. And so just to overlook all of this context and just try to simplify it and make it like a personal thing with Putin, or just in general, like, oh, Russia's crazy. They're just absolute motherfuckers over there. We don't know what to do with them Russians. It just, God, I can't stand it. Um, but so much of American politics is like that anymore. Everything needs to be condensed into a tweet or made funny on the Tonight Show or whatever. Just easy to consume, not too hard to think about. Um, and of course, everyone is in the habit now of picking a side and taking everything that side offers wholesale. And so there are all these massive black and whites. Like, for example, I'm, some flavor of trans or just cross dresser or something. I don't even know what to tell you, honestly. But at the same time, like, I'm a gun owner. I love guns. I'm a fucking gun nut. I carry a gun every goddamn day. They fucking ever since I got my carry permit, what, like 4 years ago? I think it was 4 years ago. Um, I carry a gun every time I leave my house, unless, of course, I'm going to like. There was a time I had jury duty, for example. Of course, I'm not going to take it into the courtroom. They would just search me and find it anyways. But you know, I had an AR-15. I sold it. I have an AR-10 now, which if you know anything about guns, that's the big boom. But yeah, I'm not like pro gun control or anything. I don't think like, oh, I had an AR-15, but I got rid of it because it's evil. Like, no, I love those motherfuckers. It was a lot of fun. I just sold it because I have an AR-10 now. Um, it was kind of a budget rifle, anyways, and my ex wanted it, so sold it. Um, and so people are always surprised when I mention that. Like, what? A trans person with guns? Like, what world is this? And it's just like, oh my fucking god! Like, think outside of this like perfect 100% black and white dichotomy, all or nothing, one or the other, us versus them, Coke and Pepsi. Like, oh, it's so frustrating. Um, just the way that people either they just go with what their parents thought or they rebel against their parents, and so they pick like one or the other, and they never question anything. um and they have like this perfect homogenous fucking alliance with like every last little detail of whatever side's views. Like if you're going to be a Democrat, then of course you're going to hate guns, blah blah blah. All that shit just drives me fucking insane. And so of course that same mentality is being applied to the Ukraine situation. Even on my side, like the far left, there are a lot of like extreme leftists who are backing Russia on this because of groups like Azov Battalion and Right Sector being kind of assimilated into the Ukrainian military. Of course, their position is always going to be fuck NATO, fuck America, fuck Nazis. Most of that I agree with 90% of the time or more. Fuck Nazis, I agree with 100% of the time, unequivocally. But I don't feel like we then say, okay, well, Russia's the good guy here. I think it's possible for us to acknowledge that Ukraine is kind of, having their own, to quote a show that I can't stand, their own giant douche and turd sandwich situation here. Like, NATO, their intentions for Ukraine are not coming from a place of charity. And of course, Russians aren't. That's not even a fucking question to ask, unless, of course, you're like really whacked in the head and think that, the Soviet Union needs to be resurrected, or if you're extremely fucked in the head and you're like, actually, Tsarist Russia, let's just have them be an actual fucking feudal empire again. Um, but yeah, most of us living on planet Earth with normal non-Swiss cheese brains realize that Russia doesn't have good intentions for Ukraine. And I hope people will come to the realization that the US isn't doing it as an act of kindness either. Um, if I could have whatever I wanted out of this situation, I would like to see, of course, Russia back down. Um, if Ukraine wants to be in NATO, that's their choice. Um, but I would hope that they would get into it being fully aware of what comes with that, um, because they will be expected to do some things for the sake of some of the other member states that shouldn't be their business. But if you're going to be in the group, you're going to pay your dues, I guess. Uh, so I would hope that they would be aware of that. But I would also really hope that NATO, EU, anyone else they join would have a stern talk with them about the presence of their far right paramilitaries, because that shit needs to be gone fucking yesterday. Um, because as much as I'm worried about the ethnic tensions between Russians and Ukrainians, of course neo Nazis have ethnic tensions with everyone except themselves, and religious problems, and of course the persecution of queer people, the disabled, anyone who doesn't agree with them politically. um, they're just kind of antithetical to life in general for the most part. So um, that's a problem that needs solved. However, that would be done. Um, I don't particularly give a fuck what happens to a goddamn Nazi, but um, yeah, it's just, see what I mean. There's so much going on here. My head is swimming just trying to take some of this information in. I know that I've ultimately barely even scratched the surface. If you've been sitting here sounding like I know what I'm talking about, wait till you hear somebody who actually does know what they're talking about. Oh my God. Um, and so that's the lesson of the day. The planet is complicated. Politics, geopolitics are very complicated. And so, boiling it down to Putin mean is just so fucking stupid. Can't stand it. But I don't know. Again, I'm rambling at this point, so I'll probably call it here. I hope anybody got anything useful out of all of this. The regret is setting in. This is my cue to say goodbye.